In 1926, the most famous architect in Spain died on a street corner. He got hit by a tram, and nobody helped him because everyone thought he was homeless. His clothes were falling apart, he hadn't shaved in weeks, and he had no ID on him. But he wasn't homeless, he was rich and world famous. He had just spent so many years working on one church that he completely stopped taking care of himself. Now here's a second guy, a mathematician. He locked himself in his attic for years to solve one math problem. He kept it a secret and he barely told anyone, not even the people he had worked with every day. And then, when he finally came out of his office and showed the world what he'd done, a room full of the smartest people in his field gave him a standing ovation. But just 2 months later, they found a mistake in his equation. Both of these guys were obsessed. And I think being obsessed is the only way anyone has ever made anything great. Not discipline, not being consistent, obsession, the kind that actually takes things away from you. I'm also going to show you a third guy, and he's really special, but we'll get to him later. Let's start with the mathematician. His name is Andrew Wiles, and when he's 10 years old, he's in a library and he finds a book about the famous math problem. It's called Fermat's Last Theorem. Here's the thing about this problem. It's simple enough that a 10-year-old can understand what it's asking. But nobody had been able to prove it for about 350 years. Every serious mathematician who tried had failed before him. It was basically the most famous unsolved problem in math at that time. And this random kid decides he's going to be the one who solves this problem. Now normally that's just a cute story that goes nowhere. Kids say a bunch of stuff, but he actually becomes a mathematician. He ends up as a professor at Princeton, which is one of the most famous universities in the world, and then in the mid-1980s he realizes there might be actually a way to solve this problem. And he makes a decision that is honestly kind of insane. He stops working on everything else. He drops his other project, he doesn't tell his colleagues what he's doing. He pushes a few small, unimportant papers over the years, just so nobody gets suspicious and asks him questions. And he goes up into his attic and works on this one problem, alone, for 7 years. And I want you to understand why that's so extreme. In the academic world, your whole career depends on constantly publishing new work. If you go quiet for 7 years, people assume that you're finished. And he did this on purpose, with no guarantee that any of it would work. Then, in June 1993, he gives a series of lectures in Cambridge. 3 days long, he walks through the whole thing step by step, and then, at the end of the third day, he writes Fermat's last theorem on the board and basically just says, "I think I'll stop here." Then the room goes insane. It's on the front page of the New York Times the next day. 350 years unsolved, and after 7 years alone in an attic, it is done. Except it wasn't done, because when you solve something that big, other mathematicians have to check your work first, line by line. It's like a final inspection before it counts as real. And a few months later, during that check, someone finds a hole in it. Not a typo, an actual gap in one of the most important steps, which means the proof doesn't work. And here's what makes this so brutal. It wasn't private. He'd already told the entire world. It was in the newspapers. So now the rumor is spreading through his whole field that the most famous proof of the century has a hole in it, and nobody knows if it can be fixed. He spends about a year trying to fix it, at first completely alone, but he gets nowhere. He said that that year was the hardest of his working life. 7 years of work, the thing he'd wanted ever since he was 10 years old, and it's just sitting there broken, in public, while everyone can watch him. Most people quit right there, and honestly, quitting would have been the reasonable thing to do. He'd already done something huge. The work was still valuable, he could have walked away and kept most of his reputation. But instead of doing that, he brings in a former student of his, Richard Taylor, and they kept going. And in September 1994, over a year after he told the world, 8 years into the whole thing, he finds the fix. It gets published in 1995. Fermat's last theorem is finally, actually solved. And I think that last year is the most important part of this whole story. Not the 7 years before it, the year after it broke in front of everyone. Because at that point, he had nothing left motivating him. No excitement, no pride. Everyone had already watched him fail. The only thing keeping him going was that he refused to accept a world solved this problem. Alright, but I don't want to only show you the good ending, because that's the part everyone includes, and the cost is the part that everyone leaves out. So, the architect from the beginning. His name is Antoni Gaudi, and in 1883, when he's 31, he takes over building a church in Barcelona called the Sagrada Familia, and it becomes the thing he does for the rest of his 43 years remaining. And it gets more extreme over time. In 1914, he quits every other project he has. He just refuses all other work. He turns down interviews, and in his last year, he's basically living inside the construction site, in a small room full of models and drawings. He barely eats. He wears the same worn-out clothes every day, and he stops caring about how he looks entirely. And then, in June 1926, he's walking to church like he did every single day. And the tram hits him. And because his clothes are ruined and he has no ID on him, everyone who sees it assumes he's a homeless man. Taxi drivers refuse to take him, he doesn't get proper medical care, and it takes until the next morning for someone from the Sagrada Familia to come and recognize him. And by then, it's too late. He dies just 3 days after his accident. The most famous architect in Spain died on the street because people thought he was homeless. That's how far he'd let himself go while working on that particular church. And here's the part that actually gets me. When he died, the church was only about a quarter finished, and he knew that. He knew for decades that he would never see his project completed. He gave 43 years and his entire life to a building he knew he'd never get a look at its final stage. And now, in 2026, the main structure of the building is completed, but there are still people working on it and it's still not completely finished. So, that's the cost side of things, and I'm not going to make it sound nicer than it is. Wiles gave up 7 years and basically a decade of a normal career, but Gaudi gave up everything, including ever seeing the results. Nobody who's made something great got to keep everything else too. That trait does not exist, and I think a lot of the stuff aimed at people our age pretends it does. So, here's my actual point. Think about what would have happened if Wiles had done this halfway, worked on it part-time, and kept his other projects going, published normally, and just poked at the problem on weekends. He probably would have ended up with nothing, and not the work that he has actually achieved. There's no partial credits on something like that. Either the proof works or it does not. Same with Gaudi. A church you sort of worked on isn't just a smaller church. It's just a pile of stone without any intent and real purpose. And I think this is true way more often than people realize, even in normal everyday stuff. Think about anything you've ever done halfway. A workout you kind of did, a project you sort of finished, something you messed around with for a month and then dropped. What did you actually get out of it? Nothing, right? Not a smaller result, but nothing at all. That's the thing about doing something halfway, and I don't think people get. You don't end up with less, you end up with nothing, and you spend all that time on it. It's the worst possible deal, and it's one most of us pick without even thinking about it. And I don't actually think that's because people are lazy. I think it's because going all in means you find out how good you really are. And as long as you're only trying halfway, you can always tell yourself you would have made it if you really had gone for it. Alright, here's where I have to be honest with you. Because if I ended the video here, I'd only be telling you 2 random biographies about being obsessed. But now comes Bobby Fischer. He was probably the most naturally talented chess player who ever lived, and also one of the most obsessive people in the history of any sport. He dropped out of school at 16 because it was getting in the way of chess. He studied it so much he had almost nothing else in his life, no real hobbies, and barely any friends. So, in 1972 he beat Soviet world champion Boris Spassky and became world champion himself. At the time that was a huge deal politically because it was the Cold War and the Soviets had dominated chess for decades. It's probably the most famous chess match ever played. And then he never defended the title, not once. In 1975 he made a list of demands nobody would agree to, and just gave up the title rather than play. And then he basically disappeared. Decades of living alone, he had gotten more and more paranoid over time, and he started saying things that made the public view of him really negative, and everyone who has supported him walked away from him. He died later in Iceland in 2008, mostly alone. And here's the part I really want you to think about. His obsession didn't fail him. It worked perfectly. It made him the best in the world at the thing he wanted to be the best at. It did exactly what obsession is supposed to do. The problem was what he pointed it at. Fischer's obsession was about beating people, beating the Soviets, beating the system, beating whoever was sitting across from him. And the problem with that is that there is no finish line. There's always someone else you could beat. So when he finally won and there was nobody left above him, his obsession didn't just switch off. It went looking for new enemies, and when it ran out of real ones, it started making them up. Now compare that to the other two. Wiles pointed his obsession at a math problem, while Gaudi pointed his at a church. Both of those have an actual ending. There's something that exists at the end that didn't exist before. Fischer's never had an ending built into his obsession at all. Same amount of it, same intensity, two of them built something, one of them just ran out of people to beat. So, how do these things I talk about apply to you if you're not trying to solve a 350-year-old math problem? Number 1. Find the thing you'd already be obsessed with if you let yourself. Wiles didn't pick that problem because it was a smart career move. He found it when he was 10 and never let go of it. I think most people already know what theirs is, and they've spent years talking themselves out of it, because caring about something that much makes you look weird, and being normal is comfortable. So I personally don't think that there's anything wrong with chasing a childhood dream, and I think if you can, just go for it. 2. Decide what you're giving up before you start. Actually specifically and not just vaguely. Wiles knew he was trading away 7 years of a normal career. Gaudi knew he'd never see the church finish and did it anyway. You get to make a choice on purpose, which is a real advantage, and most people waste it by just never thinking about it. So I am telling you to just run it quickly through your head. If you want to do something, think about, for example, how long that will take. How much time, for example, you will have to sacrifice for your goal. 3. Pick something where you actually build something. This is the Fischer lesson. If the reason you're doing something is to prove someone wrong, you'll never actually be finished, because there always will be another person to beat. Pick something you want to create instead. Then you can actually get there and get it done. 4. Expect the part where it falls apart. This is the Wiles part, and I think it's the most useful thing in this video. Almost everything worth doing has a stage where it visibly breaks. Usually in front of other people, and usually after you've already put years of work into it. And that's not your sign to stop, that's just the part nobody puts into a video. And I think this can be anything. For example, a plateau in a weight loss journey, or just not having any creative drive anymore when you're, for example, doing content. 5. Accept that you can't be balanced about it. You can be well-rounded, or you can be genuinely great at one thing, at least for a while. I don't think you get both at the same time, and pretending you do is probably why a lot of people spend years being mediocre at 5 things instead of actually being good at one. So here's where I land on all of this. One guy sat in an attic for 7 years working on a problem he'd wanted since he was 10. Told the world he solved it, watched it fall apart in public, and then spent another year trying to fix it while everyone thought he had failed. Another guy gave up 43 years to a church he knew he'd never see finished, and then he died on the streets because he looked like a homeless person. And the third guy pointed that exact same obsession at beating people instead of building something. Then became the best in the world, and then had nothing left to do with himself for the next 35 years. All 3 of them were obsessed. All 3 of them paid for it, and 2 of them left something behind to be remembered. So yeah, I think you have to be obsessed. Doing something halfway really will get you nothing. Not less, nothing at all. And it's going to cost you something real. And anyone who tells you otherwise probably hasn't built anything for themselves yet. Just make sure you pick something you actually want to build, because obsession is going to work either way. That's the scary part. It'll make you the best in the world at whatever you're pointing it at. It doesn't care whether that goal is worth it or not. So, I am telling you to make something of yourself and to build something worth remembering.